But he's not.
Okay.
Yes, whether he's
Just send in my
food
I'm sorry, just to confirm, you said you two were going to reverse order. Sounds good to me.
The show is like
It was something, sure, nobody's person.
First to say, I'm always invited today. First time I knew it. I've never been in this one. I've been there, the other one. Sure. So they're on
Polish remarks, I mean, Woodruff staff.
They all come down at the same time. That's very valuable. Little things you have to, make sure that you turn off.
Well, politics is a blood sport.
That's fine.
Have you been in Washington?
Okay. That's fine, not a problem at all. Part of the process, actually.
I don't know, we're broke now, because too much was spent on the recent missions to Pakistan. The earthquake. So,
Did you go on some of that?
no, I have no qualifications or expertise at all. In fact, I did it away. I've got people who so I did. I'm not complaining. It's just that that is their priority. So, but when the finances are reestablished,
That's fine.
they seem to be stuck in the mud out there. I have heard 7.5 billion is the largest figure for what the international
Something came across the internet.
You speak first.
Things that are having to be brought in and their lots are not declared for customs and supposed to have.
Sounds like an expensive.
They're clearing it through Medan, through this container terminal?
Well, some of them in Medan, some of them in Creole. It doesn't matter too much. It's that they're not being, the rapid clearance that was promised isn't necessarily taking place.
Well, why I mentioned Medan is a control. Good mayor.
We speak with you, Hallelujah.
It's up to you, people with PowerPoint, speaking out of their eyes.
I think I'm probably good here.
Okay. But if he's not, you're away with one.
Well, yeah.
But tell me, the situation is schooling.
Well, they had people back in, they had people back back in school was about 3 weeks.
Including in
many of the tent camps, they had 10 schools. I visited a bunch of them.
big shortage of teachers, not a lot of teachers.
Well,
By you?
what the people who were involved in temporary schools, at least the people that I know, what they did, they gave them fresh course training in teaching. They found they had temporary teachers. I met a lot of them. Yeah, they weren't the most best, but they were not bad. And those teachers in temporary positions for 6 months. And since then, I think there has been more teacher training, but there needs to be still more. There are many locations. I believe so, but they're also putting as much emphasis as they can on training locally. And you say, that's exactly what it's designed for. You say, you say that's just assigned something that the university can't get the details on teacher training. So, I think it could be better, but the schools that are living in
You say last year or the year before, the AID started getting a few million, maybe as much as 100 or so million for education. They expanded the program, they ain't anymore.
well, there's their regular program all over the country. And then, as I understand, yes, and then as I understand it, there's an extra earmark for I haven't, Al has. And I try to stay in fairly close contact with the education people on the ground.
I guess that school construction is just as big a problem as housing construction.
Well, the last time I was there, even in fact, when I was there in September, as well as when I was there in November, I was seeing the beginnings of temporary schools go up. They're pretty cheap, and my guess is that they are hot and dark. And most of that focuses on elementary school.
A lot of the mosques survive. Most students, teachers.
That was certainly part of it. Some survived, some didn't, but they've done a good job about getting those started up. I think that based on what I've seen, which admittedly is not they've done quite a good job of getting the school system back into some semblance of they don't have enough books yet, but then they didn't have enough books before.
Yeah, we're not talking about
No, we're talking about maybe the Mississippi.
Well, good afternoon. We're going to, as most of you know, we're still waiting for one more speaker, but we're assured that he is in the vicinity. But we're going to go ahead and get ourselves started. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. As I expect most of you know, we are the nation's official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. We aspire to capture his twin interests in solid scholarship and in public affairs, and to bring into the same room and to encourage dialogue between those responsible for the making of policy and those who are best informed on international affairs and public policy and research it and write about it. I'm Bob Hathaway. I direct the Asia program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And so this is our first event of the new year, and so Happy New Year. We're delighted to have you. This event today is the first in a series of events we'll be hosting this spring, looking at issues of institutional and capacity building in Southeast Asia. Compared to Northeast Asia, the region of Southeast Asia is, if not actually ignored, badly underappreciated in policy and research centers around this town. And yet, for a multiplicity of economic and political and security reasons, Southeast Asia deserves our attention. You know that, you believe that, or you wouldn't be here today. Hence, this series of programs that we intend to organize in the coming months. A series, I should note, made possible by the generosity of the GE Foundation. And I want to express my keen appreciation today to the Foundation for its financial assistance, which is making this program and the subsequent programs in this series possible. There are two other people I would like to acknowledge before we get started today. Many of you know Amy McCready Thernstrom, who worked here at the Center in the Asia program for many years, who has recently left us to have her first child. She had a baby boy on the last day of December, just in time to get the tax deduction. Amy actually felt ambivalent about this because that's also her birthday, and she wasn't at all sure she wanted to share her birthday with her firstborn, but that's the way it worked out. Amy did much of the legwork and provided much of the brain power in the early stages of organizing today's event. We miss her. She may in fact be watching this program via webcast right now. So Amy, if you are, we want you to know that you are missed around here. We wish you well in your new life as a mom. And we certainly thank you for your more than 5 years of dedicated service to the Asia program and the Wilson Center. The other person I want to acknowledge is in way of an introduction. Michael Kugelman, who is 3 people to the left of me, my left, your right. Michael stepped in after Amy departed to oversee the organization of this program. He will moderate the program today. He will edit the publication, which we will produce after this event. He is a relatively new member of the Asia program staff, but we are delighted to have him. And as you get to know Michael in the months ahead, you will come to agree with us that he is simultaneously a well-informed, astute observer of Asia, but also, and frankly equally importantly, an awfully nice fellow. So Michael, we're glad you're here with us. This is Michael's first program. Michael, now that I've built up everybody's expectations about you, don't louse it up. And I'm happy to turn things over to Michael. Thanks all of you all for joining us today.
Thank you, Bob, for that very kind introduction. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming here this afternoon. We're now 1 year removed from the devastating Asian tsunami of December 26, 2004, which affected 12 different nations. The damage it wrought is staggering. The exact figures are difficult to come by, but total human deaths arising from the tsunami number somewhere around 200,000. Hundreds of thousands of homes were destroyed, and more than 1 million people became homeless in an instant. Indonesia was particularly hard hit. the BBC has reported that some coastal villages in Indonesia may have lost more than 70% of their inhabitants. In Aceh province, around 130,000 people died. According to Indonesian government figures, about 530,000 Indonesians nationwide were displaced. The international response to the tsunami has been dramatic, with unprecedented levels of relief aid and donations. So where do things stand 1 year after the tsunami? On the one hand, tens of thousands of people across Aceh still live in tent camps and transitional housing. Yet on the other hand, homes are being rebuilt, dire predictions of widespread disease and malnutrition have not materialized, and a December 2005 UN report estimates that 120,000 people in Aceh have benefited from cash for work programs. Clearly, progress is being made, even as challenges remain. This afternoon's program aims to address several different questions. One, what can be said about the effectiveness of the post-disaster response on a national and on an international level? Two, what has been the tsunami's effect on governance, capacity, and institution building in Indonesia? And finally, three, what challenges remain, particularly for the Indonesian government? I'm very pleased this afternoon to be joined by three distinguished speakers, each with different experiences and backgrounds. You should have a handout in front of you that lists biographical information, so for that reason I'll be brief as I introduce each speaker this afternoon. Our first speaker today will be Roberta Cohen. Roberta Cohen is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she co-directs the Brookings University of Bern project on internal displacement. She also serves as principal advisor to the representative of the UN Secretary General on the human rights of internally displaced persons. Ms. Cohen?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Overall, the United Nations got high marks for its response to the tsunami. It acted immediately, raising international awareness to the disaster, mobilizing funds, $13.6 billion, 75% of which have been received, and playing a notable role in coordinating one of the largest or most comprehensive relief operations in history. Indeed, UN officials often point out that as a result of its efforts, epidemics were averted, food was delivered, most children now are back in school, and tens of thousands are employed and earning money again. The United States has also come in for praise. Its military was quick to undertake rescue and relief operations, and the U.S. government pledged something like $950 million more than any other nation. In addition, U.S. private and corporate donations came close to $1.5 billion. Indeed, polls have found a more favorable view of the United States because of the American response to the tsunami. But something is missing from this picture. First, the response to the emergency phase of the disaster must not be confused with the response to the reconstruction phase. It could take 5 to 10 years to succeed at recovery. Second, a close look must be given to the extent to which the survivors have actually benefited. Michael began to say that 80% of the survivors are still living in temporary shelters, many of which are substandard. In Aceh, out of some 500,000 left homeless, I have read that at least 200,000 are still living with friends and relatives, 75,000 are in temporary barracks, and 68,000 are in tents. Many are without access to clean water, sanitation, and health care. Large numbers have no jobs, and there seems to be almost complete neglect of psychosocial health services to deal with trauma. It is the survivors who must be placed at the center of any evaluation, together with the response of their national governments, which, after all, have the primary responsibility for their welfare and security. For putting the survivors at center stage and measuring the national response, there exists a set of international guidelines, the guiding principles on internal displacement, which are outside if anyone would like a copy. which apply to persons uprooted by conflict as well as natural disaster, who remain within the borders of their own countries. The guiding principles set forth the rights of internally displaced persons and the obligations of governments to these populations. Although not a binding document like a treaty, the guiding principles have regularly been acknowledged by UN resolutions as an important tool and standard for dealing with situations of internal displacement. The UN Secretary General has called upon governments to apply them. The World Summit document, which heads of state adopted in September 2005, recognized them as an important international framework for the protection of IDPs, as the internally displaced are called. As a participant in the process which developed the principles, I introduced them at a seminar in Jakarta 5 years ago, which my project at Brookings organized together with Komnas HAM, the Indonesian Human Rights Commission, and the University of Indonesia and UN agencies. At the time, there were more than 1 million Indonesians uprooted by conflict in the country, and officials from the central government and affected provinces, as well as international organizations, NGOs, and research institutions, came together to discuss the problem. One of the seminar's major recommendations was the wide dissemination of the guiding principles by the Indonesian government, in particular to the police and military, regional government officials, and local communities hosting IDPs. Seminar participants also called for the translation of the principles into Bahasa Indonesia, which was subsequently done, and I have a copy here of the principles in Bahasa Indonesia. Further, the magazine Tempo featured the principles, which we were very pleased with. Let us now evaluate the response to the tsunami within the framework of the guiding principles. The principles begin with prevention, making clear that governments have a responsibility to prevent or mitigate the conditions that lead to displacement. What does that mean in the case of natural disaster? It means putting into place early warning systems, disaster preparedness plans at the village level, and housing standards that make buildings better equipped to withstand the effects of earthquakes. These are, in fact, the fundamental rights of populations living in high-risk areas. Since the tsunami, there's been some progress in this area. An early warning system for the entire Indian Ocean region is being developed to prepare every country's weather service to receive warnings, and it should become operational by mid-2006. But this is only a first step. National education campaigns and standards for disaster-resistant construction are needed, as called for by the UN Tsunami Envoy Bill Clinton. Indonesia is a country prone to natural disasters, making it important for monitoring to take place to ensure that preventive steps are taken. Access. Another fundamental right of displaced persons is access to humanitarian and construction assistance. Following the tsunami, the Indonesian government, to its credit, opened up Aceh to foreign air forces, international and local aid organizations, and the media. But complications arose from carrying out an international relief effort in areas previously closed off to UN agencies and NGOs. Their long absence during years of conflict meant that they were not familiar with the terrain, which served to slow the response. Moreover, suspicions about international aid, as well as national pride, at times interfered with the aid effort. During the first 3 months in Aceh, foreign agencies didn't know whether they would be allowed to stay after March and could not therefore plan effectively. In the case of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, it was asked to leave, even though UNHCR was engaged in a $60 million program to build up to 35,000 permanent homes in Aceh. The representative of the UN Secretary General on the human rights of internally displaced persons was able to visit Thailand and Sri Lanka in March, but did not receive a visa to visit Indonesia. Despite these instances, the province of Aceh has become open, and UNHCR has been invited back, and the openness is a considerable advance toward meeting international standards. Non-discrimination. According to basic humanitarian principles, aid must be based on impartiality and non-discrimination, which means that political opinion, race, religion, and ethnicity are not to influence who receives the aid and in what amount. During the first 6 months after the tsunami, there were reports of aid being denied to groups or areas suspected of sympathizing with the GAM. Also reported was a disparity in treatment between those uprooted by conflict in Aceh, who numbered some 100,000, and those uprooted by the tsunami, some 500,000. It took until May for aid workers to be allowed to travel beyond the coast into areas ravaged by conflict. One analyst saw large numbers of burnt out and abandoned houses and reported that survivors of the conflict resent that virtually all the humanitarian assistance was going to tsunami survivors. A Jakarta Post article described those displaced by conflict as off the radar and agenda of the Indonesian government. The peace agreement between the government and the GAM in August 2005 led to efforts to reduce this disparity. The government announced that it would deal with both conflict and tsunami-affected populations to avoid inequities and tensions in the reconstruction process. As Human Rights Watch aptly put it, the government found it not to be in its interest to create a golden coastline of new housing and benefits while the rest of the province remains underdeveloped and ravaged by the war. The Reconstruction Agency for Aceh and Nias, the BRR, set up in April 2005, has resumed responsibility for both tsunami and conflict-affected areas, with Director Kuntoro Mangusubroto affirming that the reintegration of both groups is integral to the peace-building process. The World Bank has also begun supporting a compensation program for communities affected by conflict. However, the disparity remains, in part exacerbated by many international humanitarian organizations whose funds are earmarked only for those uprooted by the tsunami. Protection of property rights. The destruction of land title deeds and property records and the loss of coastal land have led to many problems with compensation, property ownership, and inheritance issues. The absence of formal title has put the poor at a severe disadvantage. Women, too, especially widows, face discrimination in regaining their homes and property. Further, the creation of buffer and security zones has interfered with exercising property rights, as well as freedom of movement and the right to earn a living. Director Kuntoro of the BRR has taken a flexible, pragmatic attitude toward buffer zones, but clear policies and administrative mechanisms are needed to review claims, help survivors replace lost documents, ensure that non-traditional forms of ownership are recognized, clarify the location of exclusion zones, and provide assistance to people who lost their land and livelihoods. Steps are also needed to help widows secure legal title to land and housing in their own names, recognize married women on title deeds, and ensure that orphan children receive entitlements to land and compensation. The World Bank has been working with the government on land titling issues, but Walter Kalin, the representative of the UN Secretary General on IDPs, considers the most effective way of handling large-scale property issues is to create a dedicated administrative body with a mandate for mediation, adjudication, and flexible types of remedies. Modification of laws and policies are also needed to ensure that customary rights and non-traditional forms of ownership evidence are recognized and to promote women's rights. Attention to vulnerable groups. In every emergency, there are groups with special needs who easily become left behind. In the case of children, the Indonesian government, in collaboration with UNICEF, rapidly undertook programs to prevent trafficking. Separated children were moved in with extended families and communities rather than being spirited away to other parts of Indonesia or abroad for adoption. Guarantees are also needed to ensure that children receive entitlements to land and compensation owed to their families. In the case of women, the presence for many months of military forces in and around relocation centers, as well as lack of privacy in the barracks set up for IDPs, resulted in a rise in sexual and gender-based violence. In addition, domestic violence has come to the fore as well as reports of forced marriages of young women survivors to older men. Given the shortage of women, 3 times as many women perished in the tsunami as men. Income generation programs for women have been introduced, but the virtual exclusion of women from the rehabilitation and reconstruction process is also regularly reported. Consultation with affected populations. In 2001, at the seminar in Jakarta on internal displacement, Indonesian civil society representatives, one after the other, criticized what they called the top-down approach of the government in dealing with IDPs. What they wanted was what they called a bottom-up approach, or consultation with the affected communities. Unfortunately, some of the same criticism is being leveled today. Indeed, one of the reasons that large portions of the government's master plan for Aceh had to be modified was because it was developed with little input from local communities. Throughout these tsunami-affected countries, representative of the UN Secretary General, Kalen, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing pointed to insufficient consultation with survivors in the formulation of need and loss assessments, aid distribution, and reconstruction. Lack of consultation has resulted in the setting up of temporary housing at times far from the livelihoods of survivors and far from transport. Lack of consultations has also resulted in camp designs that fail to protect women. If reconstruction plans are to be sustainable and accepted by local communities, consultation mechanisms must not be one-time events, but a structured part of the planning process as called for by the guiding principles. To its credit, the BRR's approach is participatory, and the Women's Empowerment Bureau of Aceh, the World Bank, and others are seeking to establish consultation mechanisms. Nonetheless, a study published in October found a dearth of community involvement in policy making and insufficient numbers of people, of local people, in key positions in the organizations and international agencies working on reconstruction in Aceh. Preserving the civilian character of the relief and reconstruction effort. In the wake of disaster, military capacity can be invaluable to rescue and relief operations. Indeed, the Indonesian military, in the first weeks after the disaster, played a critical role in saving people, delivering aid, and providing access for humanitarian agencies. But its continued role for months thereafter in the relief effort in Aceh gave rise to concerns that humanitarian aid was being used as a tool to assert control over a population in need. With the August peace agreement, such concerns declined. At least half of the nearly 50,000 troops in Aceh withdrew, and the way is being paved for civilian self-government and oversight of the province. In addition, the BRR has been tasked with coordinating the reconstruction effort and by all accounts is making progress. Nonetheless, it should be firmly established, whether in peace or wartime, that humanitarian aid is the responsibility of civilian institutions. The military's long history of human rights abuse in Aceh make it essential that neutral civilian institutions with experience in relief and reconstruction be the ones that are authorized to oversee the recovery effort. The slow pace of recovery and reconstruction. Although timelines are not provided for in the guiding principles, it is understood that recovery and reconstruction in response to a disaster must be as speedy as possible. Although some Indonesian government and UN officials defend the pace of the reconstruction on the grounds of the sheer devastation in Aceh and the need for a careful and well-planned response. In May, the then new head of BRR expressed shock at the slow pace of the reconstruction. Kuntoro told the press, "There are no roads being built, there are no bridges being built, there are no harbors being built. When it comes to reconstruction, zero." Since its establishment in late April, the BRR has moved quickly to get projects approved for roads, schools, houses, and ports, and in the second half of 2005, construction speeded up. But the BRR must cope with a long and growing list of challenges. Bureaucracy is one, reflected in the slow disbursement of funds to Aceh. Coordination is another. As for the 120,000 houses that need to be built, there are property ownership issues, shortages of land, the difficulties in finding building materials, the inexperience of NGOs in building houses, the loss of a large number of professionals in Aceh that could have done this, and transport and logistical problems. In addition, there is corruption. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono came into office on an anti-corruption platform in 2004 and has been serious in seeking to uproot the practice. Kuntoro was appointed director of BRR because of his integrity. And in fact, he told an audience in Washington that the main reason the Reconstruction Agency was created was to ensure that it would not be tainted by the corrupt practices of other government bodies. But it's also true that Transparency International ranked Indonesia the 5th highest country in the world for corruption. Bribes are reported to be needed for identity cards and land certificates. And NGOs like Indonesia Corruption Watch, as well as the media, have drawn attention to siphoning off of aid by the military, favoritism by local officials towards select constituencies, and the difficulty of the state's auditing agency in accounting for all the donations received. A USAID document points out that weak governing institutions, inadequate rule of law, and pervasive corruption are the principal obstacles facing the new government. Clearly, it will be a challenge for the government to ensure that corruption does not undermine the response to tsunami reconstruction, and that a sharp reduction takes place between the large amount of funds received, 4.4 billion to date, out of 7.5 billion pledged, and the results achieved on the ground. One promising way to initiate human rights monitoring of the reconstruction plan would be to request the National Human Rights Commission to undertake this role and to strengthen its capacity to do so. National human rights commissions may be created by the state, but they can exercise a certain amount of independence and are in a position to monitor government performance, advise governments when their policies and laws need to be improved, and receive and act upon complaints. In August 2005, Komnas HAM, together with the National Human Rights Commissions of the Asia-Pacific region, adopted guidelines on internally displaced persons in situations of natural disaster, which set forth the steps that commissions should take. In particular, the guidelines call for monitoring by the commissions of how the human rights of IDPs are being respected. At a meeting of National Human Rights Commissions in Colombo in October, in which I participated, the representative of Komnas HAM pointed out that the commission had been taken off guard by the tsunami, not having been designed to deal with natural disasters. But now it had submitted to the government a list of human rights concerns emanating from the tsunami that should be integrated into policies and programs. And these included housing rights, property rights, loss of documentation, participation in reconstruction plans, and the rights and needs of women and children. In conclusion, aid programs that pay attention to human rights have a better chance of becoming sustainable and contributing to the long-term stability of the country. In Indonesia, there is room for cautious optimism. It now has a government committed to responding to the needs of the survivors and ensuring that peace and recovery take hold in Aceh. It also has a government seeking to bring the military's financial dealings and involvement in corruption under control. At the same time, much of what was called for by the Jakarta seminar in 2001 is called for today. Non-discrimination in the provision of aid, better coordination at the national, regional, and local levels, transparency and accountability in the dispersal of funds, mechanisms to ensure that women have equal rights to land and housing, and the greater involvement of beneficiaries and host communities in planning and implementing reconstruction programs. Whether natural disaster or conflict uproots people, the government has the opportunity to build back better based on humanitarian and human rights standards. Disasters generally bring to the fore deep structural problems in countries and provide opportunities to reverse long-standing patterns of discrimination and ethnic conflict. Addressing them can create a strong foundation for recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker this afternoon will be Bambang Haramurti, Editor-in-Chief of Indonesia's Tempo weekly news magazine. He has held a variety of positions with Tempo, including Jakarta Bureau Chief and U.S. Bureau Chief. He recently received a Knight International Press Fellowship Award from the International Center for Journalists. We are very grateful that you were able to travel from Indonesia to be here with us today.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to apologize. I come late because I went to the wrong Woodrow Wilson house at 2 o'clock, and it was quite hard to get a cab to come here from that place. But I'm very happy to be here and very honored, because one of the silver lining of the horrible tragedy in Aceh, in tsunami, is that not only it brought peace to the area which has bloody conflict for the past 30 years, but also it has proven how generous the world is in helping others who had come under natural disaster. In fact, a little over 2 weeks ago, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was in Banda Aceh, and he gave quite an eloquent speech which was broadcasted all over the world about tsunami that hit Aceh a year ago and the devastating natural disaster that killed or causing the missing of 167,000 people along 800-kilometer coast of Sumatra Island and Nias, and causing, as someone has mentioned, about 1 million people displaced. And in fact, even now, they still think that about 500,000 refugees are still there. The global media coverage of this horrific human tragedy was intense and triggered an unprecedented international response. People from all over the world donated, and almost all governments sent their rescue team. More than 120 international NGOs and 4 times as much local NGOs are now involved in rebuilding Aceh and Nias. The World Bank now estimated that maybe there are about $9 billion money available to rebuild Aceh. 1/3 of it come from civil society around the world. Another third come from donor countries, official donor countries, and international institutions, and the rest come from government of Indonesia. This tsunami goodwill, this global response, is clearly something that is very good, truly a heartwarming phenomena. But on the other hand, it also creates a huge potential risk. As noted by many world leaders, including UN Special Envoy for Tsunami, former President Clinton, and the World Bank President Paul Wolfowitz, the global solidarity triggered by tsunami has to be followed by success story of Aceh rebuilding effort in order to sustain the world population generosity vis-a-vis future major disaster. Failure in accomplishing the humanitarian mission, especially if it is due to corruption, leakage, and bureaucratic incompetence, could only incite global cynicism and dry up future donation for post-disaster relief operation. In this context, the fact that about 60,000 Acehnese still live in tents a year after tsunami swept their houses is clearly an alarming condition. It is also quite ironic that when President Yudhoyono made his speech from an elaborate podium at the north side of Baitur Rahim Grand Mosque, there were still quite a few inhabited makeshift houses made from tsunami debris located less than 100 meters away from President's place. It is clearly a grim reminder that all is not well. Money, in this case, is perhaps not a problem, but clearly capacity to rebuild Aceh is far than from sufficient in meeting public expectancy. To be fair, this is not a unique problem. While American public perhaps only began to grasp about the complexities and difficulties of rebuilding a city after New Orleans was hit by Hurricane Katrina, others in the world had learned this kind of frustration caused by public over-optimism earlier. In fact, judging by post-calamities rebuilding and rehabilitation all over the world, such as in Japan when they have Kobe earthquake in 1995, in Turkey 1992 earthquake, Honduras Hurricane Mitch in 1998, in Iran earthquake at Bam City in 2003, in Venezuela in 1999 by flood, and even in USA when Hurricane Ivan in 2004. When looking at all these calamities, the World Bank considered rebuilding project in Aceh fares above average. However, the World Bank is clearly not an independent observer, as it plays a major role in Aceh rebuilding and rehabilitation effort. Indonesian public, as shown by recent public opinion poll conducted by Lembaga Survei Indonesia or LSI, is more skeptical. In June last year, only 34% of Indonesians sampled in 32 provinces in Indonesia are satisfied by central government effort in Aceh. And the local government of Aceh did even worse. Only 27% believe it has performed satisfactorily. Indonesian NGO fares better than the government, with 53% people felt satisfied, but not as good as international NGO, which reached 64%, and foreign government, which reached to 68%. The figure changed when the second survey was done 6 months later, which is in December. Satisfaction level to central government effort is improving slightly to 35%, and so did provincial government image to 32%. On the other hand, NGOs and foreign governments suffered a downturn in public eyes. Domestic NGO satisfaction level decreased to 50%, international NGO to 56%, and foreign government to 65%. This change in public perception could be attributed to the different stages of rebuilding effort in Aceh. Foreign government and international NGO and also domestic NGO played a heroic and prominent roles during the rescue effort in the first 3 months after tsunami, as they were much better equipped and financed and can operate almost independently from local government bureaucracy. After that, when rehabilitation and construction stages started to be implemented, the role of central and local government began to increase, especially after Aceh Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Agency, or known in its acronym as BRR, was officially created in April to coordinate rebuilding effort in Aceh and Nias. This new agency, which is locally known as BRR, has been heavily criticized for its slowness, quote unquote. The head of BRR, as mentioned before, Dr. Kuntoro Mangkusubroto, is a former minister who holds a PhD in management from a US university and has a squeaky clean reputation, and he is very much aware of these critics. However, he has decided to trade off speed with better planning, more bottom-up approach, and good government. His team is consisted mostly of young professionals with high integrity. His preference for integrity is much more dominant than his preference for field experiences. The result is to be expected. The institution has a very steep learning curve, but it starts from a very low point. In June, about 60% Indonesians and 24% Acehnese believe that central government effort in rebuilding Aceh is improving. 6 months later, the number increased to 74% nationwide and 27% in Aceh. It is estimated that the number will increase again this year as BRR become better organized and more in control. In 1995, or last year, about $2 billion has been spent in Aceh and Nias, and this year as much as $3 billion is expected to be spent mostly on reconstruction of houses. Last year, BRR failed to reach its target in building 30,000 houses, although by not much. Main difficulties is reorganizing land title, as most of the 600,000 land titles registered in Aceh was swept away, the documents, and also lack of transportation or of usable roads. Many parts of Aceh, for instance in Aceh Jaya Regency, especially in city of Calang, are still isolated. So does many areas in Singkil Regency, which was hit by another earthquake, 8.2 Richter earthquake, 3 months after tsunami swept their places. However, as more and more land are re-registered, I think the BRR targeted last year to have 50,000 land titles. And more roads are going to be built this year, including the US is going to build a 245 kilometers road from Banda Aceh to Melaboh. This will free some places from being isolated. It's been financed by 245 million USAID money, and it is expected to be cleared in 1 year, and therefore with these areas open from isolations, the BRR is very optimistic that about 148,000 houses will be built before the end of 2007. Part of this optimism is grounded in the fact that ideological battles in rebuilding Aceh has basically been settled. Proponent of the old way of centrally based industrial approach of reconstruction Aceh has been soundly defeated in BRR, and proponent of community-driven approach are now well entrenched. Although this approach started very slow, it has gained momentum with time, as trust with BRR is slowly but surely increasing among Acehnese, so does their optimism. Time will tell whether this optimism is not excessive. There are many factors that can influence the progress in Aceh. One of the most important is political and security situation. So far, since Aceh Peace Agreement was signed in Helsinki on August 15 last year, the situation is very encouraging. Disarmament of the military wing of Gerakan Aceh Merdeka has been conducted successfully, and so did its transformation into a political institution under the watchful eyes of the international observation. The drafting of a special law on Aceh, which is part of Aceh Peace Agreement, has been finalized at local level. Although some opposition has been heard at the national parliament, most political observers expected the law to be passed by national parliament or DPR this year. The next obstacle would be the local election in Aceh based on this new law and designed to include former rebels as candidates, so they can continue their struggle changing bullet to ballots. It would be over-optimistic to expect that the election will be conducted without any glitches. However, the question is whether both sides can contain their differences within political framework or not. Bar any major changes in national politics and GAM internal condition, I put a note here that the leader of GAM, Hasan Tiro, is now more than 80 years old and not in a good health condition. It is reasonable to expect that major armed conflict will not flare up again, but some local incidents are probably unavoidable. One of the trickiest problems that has to be solved in order to sustain peace is how to absorb former combatants and to reintegrate them successfully to civil society. Another potential for political conflict is between the elites in Banda Aceh and the local elite outside Banda Aceh, especially eastern part. Aceh province is consisted at least 7 ethnic groups with their own distinct culture and languages. While Acehnese in Banda Aceh are complaining about the role of Jakarta in their everyday life, many rural Acehnese outside Banda are resentful of Banda Aceh domination. Last month, for instance, 11 regions in eastern Aceh declared their intention to form a separate province. Another factor to be watched is the capacity of BRR and local government in providing good government. Indonesia is notorious as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. For many years since Transparency International conducted annual survey of corruption index, Indonesia has fared very badly. It is no longer considered 5 worst countries, but still remain among the bottom 10. So far, BRR has been able to retain its image as a clean institution, but most local government in Aceh are still considered prone to corruption. Last year, for instance, BRR received 206 reports of possible corrupt activities by local government, which its anti-corruption unit is investigating. The director of this unit is an Australian consultant who has worked in Indonesia for the past 15 years on good government issues. This unit has been credited in keeping Aceh clean from corrupt activities, even to the point it has been criticized as to be too rigid and causing delay in many project implementation. One of the most difficult corrupt practices that have to be eliminated is collusions among tender participants in marking up the price offered and distributing the profit to all members of this collusion. BRR has been given special power to cancel tender that it believes done in a corrupt way and has done it quite a few times. However, ironically, BRR itself is not free from being accused to be involved in corruption. At least Indonesian Corruption Watch, an Indonesian NGO, has criticized BRR in estimating its household price, which according to the Indonesian Corruption Watch estimate should be at least 32% lower. Question is BRR corrupt? Most people who know Kuntoro Mangkusubroto, and I have to admit I'm one of them, do not believe this accusation. He and President Yudhoyono, before he became president, including myself, was a co-founder of Indonesian Transparency Society quite 5 years ago when Suharto was still in power. And Mangkusubroto has proven some theories of anti-corruption when he was appointed as director of electrical department in Indonesian utility, and during his time almost every day we caught corrupt people in his office. But almost all Indonesians would consider BRR too slow. So the challenge now is how to increase the reconstruction speed in Aceh without jeopardizing its integrity. And I think I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go on to our third and final speaker this afternoon. Cortland Robinson is an assistant professor at the Center for International Emergency, Disaster, and Refugee Studies at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. In January 2005, he was in Indonesia to provide post-tsunami relief work, and I understand he plans to return in the very near future.
Thank you. I'm institutionalized at the School of Public Health toward both data and PowerPoint, so I thought I would present some images of the tsunami, some of which I'm sure you've seen before. Some are my photographs, and there's certainly nothing special in the sense of presenting anything that people don't already know or have already seen. We'll also present a little bit of data, but just by way of introduction, it was exactly a year ago today that I think I was meeting Jim McNaughton in the airport at Medan. He was on his way out. We were on our way in. It was a chaotic scene. It got more chaotic. I've done a lot of work in refugee and humanitarian emergencies. This was my first tsunami. I dare say it was most people's first tsunami. I hope it's my last. We think we've learned something about natural disasters. We don't know nearly enough. One thing we do know, and I think it's a common failing in the humanitarian community, to look at each emergency and disaster from essentially an ahistorical perspective. It's fair to say the tsunami came out of nowhere with perhaps only minutes, maybe hours of warning. But displacement and disaster in Indonesia and in Aceh pre-existed the tsunami. And as much as we do give proper credit to the emergency phase of the response, and there's certainly argument that during those first few hours and days, the focus must be on getting the job done. It's very mechanistic, it's very top-down, it's quite autocratic. It's what armies do very well, and often NGOs and UN organizations don't do so well. It's not a time for processing, it's not a time for sitting around and deciding what's the best course of action. It's not a time to sit around and discuss how many ethnic groups are in Aceh and how are they best served. It's a time for getting work done, boots on the ground. The reconstruction effort is exactly the opposite. And I think that's, in a sense, what we're up against. We're up against an emergency relief effort that was, by all accounts, quite successful. By no means the best it could have been. Better than Katrina, by a large margin, I would say. And I was down in Mississippi and Louisiana a few days after that disaster. And many credits to all kinds of different players. The Indonesian community, the Indonesian army, foreign governments, foreign militaries, non-governmental agencies, UN organizations, and many kinds of organizations that you've never heard from before and may never hear from again. Some will last, many, I hope, just go away, as many did on the next airplane out when they realized they were completely overwhelmed by the task at hand. Now comes the hard part, and it's been coming at us for some time. So these pictures, I think, are really not particularly enlightening. You've seen them before. One of the things that I think I'm struck by as a demographer, somebody who looks at numbers, and as I like to say, it's not about counting numbers, it's about making numbers count. And in demography, disaster demography, I should say, it's about trying to tease out what the numbers mean, who's missing, what the picture is showing, and what the picture is not depicting. And the numbers in Indonesia, more so than in any other country, not simply because of the scale, but partly at least because of the scale, have been fluctuating more dramatically than any of the other numbers in any of the other countries. The very first numbers coming out of Indonesia on December 27 were 4,400 dead, no missing. Within days, it was 80 or 90,000 dead. And by the time we had a sort of more formal reckoning in March, and then one might say a kind of completed number, although I don't think we'll ever be at any sort of full reckoning, 130,000 dead, still 37,000 reported as missing, presumed dead, and roughly 500,000 internally displaced. Here again, the numbers have fluctuated dramatically. First accounts, late December, early January, perhaps 75 to 100,000, more than 1 million affected. Back and forth, the numbers fluctuated. What was Jakarta reporting? What was Banda Aceh provincial government reporting? What were the UN organizations reporting? What were the NGOs reporting at the sub-district or even village or district level? There was very little convergence. And when you're trying to do proper planning and you're trying to do proper deployment of resources and assets, numbers do count. And these numbers really fluctuated dramatically. One question that remains out of this effort is how can we do a better job, whether it's a Humanitarian Information Center, UN Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, all of the other entities whose job it is to track data and information on a real-time basis in an emergency have to be doing a better job. An awful lot of fussing and fuming about maps and how different polygons didn't map according to the way the district mapped and recorded sub-districts and the way that Jakarta did. All of that spoke to, really, the history of Aceh province and the way in which Aceh was, in some respects or another, doing its own thing, and Jakarta was pretending otherwise. And in the middle came this vast army, some say a circus, of UN, NGO, international players trying to make sense of what was going on in this context. One thing that was very clear was that this was a highly localized event. If you were in these red zones, your likelihood of surviving was anywhere from about 30 to maybe 85 to 90%. If you were in the mountains, as it were, the probability of dying or being injured by tsunami was effectively zero. And much of the planning, I think, really didn't take this into account, that we had an intact community and a wiped out community and fault lines along the middle, with displacement perhaps being a much more dynamic process, but injury and mortality being, if you will, quite static, quite specific to geographical hazard. And in fact, we're working with Columbia Earth Sciences Institute to actually map mortality on the basis of geographical hazard. This was not about a bullet coming at you or a bomb coming out of the sky. This was about an earthquake and a wave. And I think more needs to be done to learn the signature of natural disaster and its impact on communities, not just who died and who was injured, but who survived and what that means in terms of the profile of surviving households in order to plan and implement better, more targeted response in a more timely way. These are just some of the numbers that have come out, not just in terms of the people dead, missing, or displaced, but the damage. And it was and remains extraordinary. And again, for all of the proper criticisms that are being levied against the reconstruction effort, I think we also have to take into account, as localized as that damage was, how extraordinarily devastating it was. These were some of the early numbers of deaths mapped by district. This is somewhat misleading. There was mortality along the East Coast. It was lower than in the heavily concentrated population area of Banda Aceh and Aceh Bazar. The highest mortality that we recorded was in Aceh Jaya, Aceh Barat, and that stands to reason. The epicenter of the quake was just off the coast, so they were hit, in a sense, twice, not only by the quake, which killed quite a large number of people with falling buildings, but the wave itself was most intense and most immediate in these West Coast areas. Damage, a very difficult thing to measure, percentage of dwellings, buildings that collapsed, partial, etc. I question some of this. I'm not sure quite what sort of damage, except perhaps some earthquake damage found in the interior of the province. But you can see displacement, again, a much more dynamic and ongoing process. There's not just initial displacement, there's secondary displacement. As people move from one place to the next, they stay with a host family for a period of time. That generosity, if you will, runs dry, taps out, and they move on. Some people left saying, I will not ever go back. That ocean is no longer friendly to me, and it is no longer a place that I will live. Others move away. Typically speaking, in the studies that we've done, the average length or distance of displacement was only a matter of a few kilometers from where one originated. And that, again, is a natural kind of statistic. But again, the destruction was extraordinary. This was taken from a plane as we were flying into Malabo mid-January of last year. And as you look down, you can see we saw a small white building in the middle of what looked like an empty field. Obviously, that's a mosque. Mosques are not built in empty fields. This was, at one time, a small, though certainly thriving village. I dare say that mortality in this particular place was not 70%. It might have been as much as 80 or 90 or 95%. There were areas along the West Coast that were essentially wiped clean, scoured of people and of buildings. Here we have a remnant of the road. Actually, this is stretching down just north of Malabo, and the small sort of IDP settlement, the distinctive blue plastic sheets that began to crop up in various areas, not just out in the countryside, but all through the urbanized areas in Banda Aceh and Aceh Bazar. One of the most distinctive things about the settlement process was that it was so localized and small scale. Some of the early estimates were that as many as 258 to 326 encampments or spontaneous camps or settlements were springing up in Banda Aceh, Aceh Bazar alone. More than half of those were fewer than 1,000 people. And of the larger ones, nothing larger than about 10,000. Some suggest that the dog that didn't bark, the infectious disease threat that even senior officials in WHO, if you remember, were saying a second tsunami of mortality is going to be coming at us and we must prepare. 150,000 more people could die of cholera, malaria, and infectious disease outbreak. I'm not sure the numbers exceeded more than a few dozen mortalities. The numbers are very spotty. The question really is, did we dodge a bullet because the intervention was so effective? Were we just dumb lucky? Was the threat overstated in order to garner more resources for whoever, fill in the blank, World Health Organization or others? Or was there some combination of factors, including, not just as I mentioned before, the fact that people were displaced, if they survived, from areas that were completely wiped out into areas that were, relatively speaking, intact, still had water, still had electricity, still had food. There were markets still flourishing, there was transportation, where roads and such were not completely cut off, and that was what made the West Coast so problematic. But where you could move into the interior and had survived and were mobile and you could move, you could find a home, you could find a mosque, you could find a school, you could find a place to stay, and there were services and food available. And one argument suggests that infectious disease risk was reduced dramatically because you did not have these large-scale agglomerations of encampments, as we saw in so many instances. Cambodia, Thai-Cambodian border, 100,000, 150,000 people, all crammed in to a very small, essentially, city surrounded by a barbed wire fence, where the risk of infectious disease outbreak and spread became much higher. So these were the kinds of pictures that you saw. And on the one hand, it looks unpleasant in the sense that people aren't going to have much in the way of protection from the rain, but there was a lot of food coming in. This was off a road that headed south from Malabo through Singkil and all the way to connections to Medan. So there were lots of trucks moving back and forth, lots of food supplies being offloaded. So a relatively well cared for population in a relatively small settlement. And I think in some respects that was a protective factor for reducing the threat of outbreak of infectious disease and other things. But even within the first few days, people were saying, what's next? Either when can I go home again, or where do I go from here if my village is wiped out? Either I don't want to go home because of fear of tsunami happening again, I can't go back because the area is completely wiped out, or maybe I wish to go back, but I have to clear the debris, or maybe I wish to go back and the government is saying at this point, no, not yet, wait and we will tell you where to go next. So questions even within the first few days after the tsunami of what's next. And I think a lot of the frustration that's building, and is maybe represented in some of these declining satisfaction levels toward NGOs, governments, and the rest, is people beginning to wonder really not only what's next, but when is that going to happen for me and my family. One of the obvious needs, of course, was temporary shelter. UN High Commissioner for Refugees, of course, the immediate question there is, what are you doing here? In fact, UNHCR asked that of Refugees International, and Refugees International asked that, I believe, right back at UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Indonesian government said essentially to UNHCR, you're right, this isn't a refugee population, please leave. They went away, I think have finally come back, but the point was well taken. This is an internally displaced population. Yes, there is a context of conflict, human rights abuse, and concerns for protection, but it is not fundamentally a refugee problem, and UNHCR was, in one sense, a little out of place. On the other hand, everybody else was there. Literally every other UN agency that one could imagine, non-governmental organization, was there, and UNHCR felt it needed to be there as part of its evolving relationship, at least, or obligation to serve in a good offices context, internally displaced as well as refugees. Shelters, IOM also played a role, UNICEF played a role. Lots of relief efforts, very uncoordinated in the first going. Often truckloads of exactly the same item would show up within hours of one another. One NGO after another would come in bringing dried noodles, cans of iced tea, water bottles by the ton, et cetera, et cetera. Not very well calibrated in terms of the kinds of food and other non-food items necessary. Certainly not very well orchestrated or coordinated. And yet, in the end, one might say that by and large, in the emergency phase, people got what they needed. They probably got an awful lot of the things that they didn't need, and maybe more water bottles than they could ever possibly drink in a lifetime. But there was basic food, shelter, medical assistance available in most cases. Not always. The West Coast was I would say, one has to treat somewhat parenthetically, but there was a remarkable effort nonetheless to respond. But one of the things that struck me, certainly, and I think many others as well, was some of the faces, particularly of the children, particularly of the people who had lost loved ones, either knew that they had been washed away because they saw them drowned, or they saw them die under a collapsing building, or perhaps even more poignantly, didn't know where they were, but just had a dread and a growing suspicion that they were also lost and not coming back. And an anecdote, a story began to circulate that more women had died in the tsunami than men. And I have to say, I was initially somewhat skeptical because, as often anecdotes do, they derive anecdotally from anecdotal evidence. Well, so-and-so went into a camp and interviewed 20 or 30 people, and they found that more of them had lost females than males. Or we looked around a camp and we saw more males than females, therefore the women died. Well, of course, it could have been a migration effect that created a disparate sex differentials in a camp. It wouldn't necessarily be mortality, but there was something plausible about this, and I'd like to talk a little bit about mortality, not just because it's something that we've focused on, but because, as I say, as mortality goes in inverse, so goes survivorship, and so goes the profile of vulnerability for those who do remain alive. So we did a number of surveys of mortality in the highly affected areas, most highly affected on the West Coast and the North, less in the East Coast. And we did, in fact, confirm two things. One is that tsunami was not an equal opportunity killer. It takes young children and elderly at much higher rates than it takes older children and younger adults. That stands to reason. That's a kind of a classic J curve of mortality, rapidly elevated in the context of a flood or an earthquake, or in this case, a combination. But the other thing that we found was that there was a very clear and distinct female mortality disadvantage. Not the 3- to 4-fold numbers that we have heard. I'm still somewhat skeptical of those, but that's just my own bias, if you will. But we did find, and these are statistically significant, in all cases, Mabo particularly strong, at least 1.2 to as much as 2 times as many women dying as men. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's not just about the loss of women and even girls. It's, first of all, it tells us something about the signature of this kind of disaster. And I think if we can properly model it, understand it, we can do a better job as we start to deploy and respond to future natural disasters, and to understand other kinds of conflict and how the shape of injury and mortality creates a certain profile of survivorship, both at the individual and household and community level. And hopefully then will enable us to do a better job of targeting and anticipating, pre-planning, pre-positioning resources the next time out. So that's the point. It's not about mortality. In this case, if you're looking at what this means, it's about survivorship. So it's children who've lost their mothers, men who've lost their wives, particularly one might say in a traditional Muslim context, men are not typically the caregivers for young children. Many men suddenly are playing that role. And I wonder, it goes to Roberta's point about psychosocial needs, we focus a lot on vulnerable populations, female-headed households, younger children, elderly. I wonder if somehow Indonesian, Achenese men are somehow being overlooked in this mix. They have suffered in one sense as survivors more grievously. They have lost more loved ones. And I can tell you a number of instances as we were doing surveys, talking to some of the men and trying to figure out why in some cases I would get this rather sort of glassy, sort of deer in the headlights look. And then as we go by a village, he would point out, that was where my wife and daughter died. And you think, stupid me, how could I possibly have not thought about that? So people are grief-stricken, and this affects all of the people who are responsible as caregivers, from government officials to nurses and doctors to husbands and wives and school teachers. But more specifically, the issue is, how do you get people from here to here? Well, do you want to get them to here? And this is a picture I took, and I won't say who built it. A lot of Indonesians, as they saw these kinds of places, noticed, one, that these houses were built within sort of 5 or 10 feet of one another, very small, not the kind of house that an Indonesian would build. And people that I spoke to in the housing and reconstruction work in the NGO community said that the point about building a home for someone else is not to sort of build it, give it to them, say, go in, here's the key, as it were, it's yours. You need to see, will they maintain it? How do they maintain it? Does it become their home? Will they rebuild in that same way, or will they rebuild something different? And if they rebuild something different, or if it goes to shambles, there are many questions that need to be asked, but one of the questions is, was it the right house in the first place? And I think we are in danger as we're moving forward, if we're not careful and not using best practices in the reconstruction process, of constructing purpose-built slums in Aceh. And that's a major problem. So as saddening and disappointing and discouraging as these pictures are, and these tents are rather shabby looking. I was back in July, and we'll go back again in February, and we all hope to see fewer of these, but I don't know as one wants to see more of those, per se. And I think, again, one of the lessons that we have not even started to learn post-disaster of this kind of scale is how, not just how do you help people get back home again, but literally what is the best kind of construction? How do you rebuild a community? And that's not just a kind of a philosophical notion. It goes to what materials does one use? What do they cost? And I think donors are looking at cost, but I think from the beneficiary standpoint, the survivors of this catastrophe, the question is really, what will be my home? What will it look like? And will it be my home, or will it just be a structure that I'm told is no longer semi-permanent but permanent, and yet it doesn't feel that way to me? The other problem, of course, is how would you reconstruct a village in a moonscape like that when you can't even get there by road or bridge? Who would go back and rebuild? Who's the first to go back? Would you put a house out there in the middle of nowhere, even if that was your home, if the next home over was several hundred yards away and you were living out in the middle of this disaster area? 1 minute. Okay, getting to the end. These are the barracks that have been built. TLCs, tender loving cares, temporary living centers, as the government has fondly put them. And for a period of time, that was the model. We will get everybody out of these increasingly shabby looking camps, and we will actually even get them out of host families, which I think was a very incorrect decision, shall we say, and move them into these nice, tidy looking, centralized, government-controlled, one might say almost military-run barracks. And for a period of time, that was the model. And I think there's some important questions that need to be asked about the wisdom of that. Fortunately, I think after some evaluations were done by OCHA and others, the government began to step back from that and say, okay, we won't just continue to sort of drive forward and build as many barracks as we possibly can. We'll try to make sure that these are properly constructed, proper sanitation, et cetera. But maybe we need to move more quickly toward permanent housing and not invest quite so much in this semi-permanent 18 to 24-month construction effort that moved people into these kinds of barracks. I should say that a lot of the concerns and criticisms about the barracks, or at least some of the criticisms, went away with the evolving peace agreement and the reality of that peace. Much of the concern that the military was going to use these barracks to consolidate the population, control relocation efforts in an attempt to undermine the GAM, et cetera. I think those concerns obviously have dissipated. And as long as the peace holds, the more fundamental question is just what kind of a place is this to live and how long should people be asked to live there? We did some studies, and I'll try to wrap this up fairly quickly and not get into a lot of the different measurements. Clearly, living space in host communities was much greater, but access to water, adequate health services, and water consumption, some of the basic things of necessities of life, were better in the barracks. And that was the general impression that people had, and other observations and assessments by OCHA and others have really reinforced the same thing. We might say that it's better in the host community. There's more community there. There's family. There's friends. But for services, you can't beat a barrack. The government actually scaled down and cut off government support for people living with host families. So there was almost an encouragement to move into the barracks. And by the same token, whether you're a UN organization or in some cases NGOs, it was easier, logistically simpler to supply barracks. Some organizations chose not to do any work in the barracks because they felt it was the wrong way to go developmentally and otherwise. But the point being, for some kinds of services, barracks were better. So there we are. We have a remarkable success, and it's holding. I wish we could say the same about Katrina, that we've achieved some new fundamental breakthrough in terms of peace and an understanding of poverty in this country and inequity. We haven't. They managed to do that in Indonesia. Sri Lanka, I think, has gone the other direction, sad to say. That's not just the silver lining, that's a very powerful central reality and truth to this. But tensions do remain. Displacement was born of conflict in Indonesia and in Aceh, and there are displaced persons who are conflict displaced who must also be assisted through this overall reintegration plan. It's not just about the tsunami affected. These are some rough numbers. You heard some others earlier. I wouldn't put much stock into them. They're just estimates, but it does suggest that we have a different reality at work here. People who are still living within host communities and host families, people living in tents, these spontaneous encampments, and people living in barracks. The plan is to have everybody home in a permanent kind of a house by mid-2007. But there are many issues. Roberta touched on many of them, and I won't belabor them, but they go to fair compensation, participation in decision-making, particularly those who are told you cannot go back to your home of record. In that case, the government insists on the right of sending you to another location that is not of your choice. And that does raise very serious questions about voluntary participation, or voluntariness of choice and participation in that decision. Certainly vulnerable groups, orphans, female-headed households, but also widowers with children, need to be, the needs of those populations need to be better understood and better incorporated, I think, and not just in the ongoing services to these camp populations, barrack populations, but in the overall plan and design to not just help people go back to a permanent structure called a home, but to actually make that a home within a village that has viable economic opportunities, that has roads that connect to markets, that has schools, etc., and that has, one might say, a better opportunity for participation on the part of all elements of the population. So it's about proper pace, speed, but it's also about proper accountability. What's that balance? I don't know. There's no formula. I'm sure the School of Public Health would love to give you one, but there isn't one. So just a few quotes to end with. One is festina lente, if you remember any of your Latin, make haste slowly. There's a small caveat. This was attributed to Emperor Augustus, who was actually purposefully, step by step, deconstructing a republic and creating an imperial dictatorship. We don't want that. But how do we avoid taking these extraordinarily large resources from outside and turning them into locally owned realities and assets? This is not a sprint, but a marathon. This is going to take a long time, said one NGO worker. And finally, a quote from one of the local Achenese. This was offered to a researcher from the East-West Center. They are talking about reconstruction of Aceh, yet how can it be when Aceh is already destroyed, even before the tsunami? We have to aim to construct Aceh, not to reconstruct it to be what it was in the pre-tsunami condition. We should aim to make the people to be again free, secure, and prosperous. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Robinson. Thank you to all three of you for some very interesting presentations that should, I would hope, provide some interesting fodder for a fruitful question and answer session. Before we take the first question, I just wanted to make a few requests. One, that you ask your question after the microphone has arrived. That way our friends on the internet can be sure to hear your questions. And also, please begin by introducing yourself, name and affiliation. And finally, please be brief. So I think we're all set. First question? We have to have something. Right over here. Mark.
My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I'm with the Usindo Aceh School Project, and I'm feeling almost troubled by speaking because I haven't been in Aceh for 6 weeks, and I think things are changing rapidly. It was interesting to listen to this because I struggle in a school building project with knowing whether I'm seeing a glass half full or a glass half empty, and I think it's both. I would like to pose a couple of questions. One has to do with if we are going to have community-based planning, which is clearly what's happening, how does it work if you don't have enough facilitators? And I've heard people talk about this as a serious problem. I would like to observe that at least in our project that I think that the BRR has been most helpful, and I've never before in my life, in and out of Indonesia, been asked if a gift, a small one, a box of candy, was worth less than $20 before the recipient of the gift, who was a friend at BRR, would even put it in his hands. Now, this is a remarkable kind of willingness for transparency, and so I think that that's something to be acknowledged and celebrated, even if it doesn't always work. The other question that I have, and would like to have some comment from all of you, is that planning and availability of information and coordination is just made more difficult because there are so many players. They do not talk to each other very well, and the technology for communication, particularly the websites, are not easily accessed because of the breakdown in physical communication modalities. I mean, try and get an email out of Aceh.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that first?
I'm not quite sure your point about, I mean, I take your point about community-based approaches need facilitators. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, whether it's proper
I mean
interlocutors linguistically,
that
culturally, politically, who can help
I
explain aid to a local population.
I mean that if you are going to have a group of people sit down and say, all right, and this is how it's being done in some communities. This floor that I can see on the side, on the ground, belonged to Bong Bong. And this one belonged to so-and-so. And how are we, so-and-so isn't alive anymore. This piece of ground has sunk. We as a community have got to decide who owns. And unless you've got somebody who is a trained facilitator to a degree, to facilitate that conversation, you don't come to good conclusions. And I've heard several people talk about the need for more help with training facilitators, so that I think that sometimes it's even a need to step back one from just saying that we need this kind of planning.
Well, if I could just make two quick comments. One is, I think, over the many years I've been involved, people pay a lot of lip service to capacity building, and there is far more genuflecting in that direction than there is actual work and resource transfer. Very often it's the case that when the big money runs out, the UN and the NGOs pack either most, if not all, of their materials and personnel and leave, or if they leave anything behind, it's good luck, hope you get a grant. So I think what I'm taking from your conversation, or your comment, is there is a need at the moment to be able to have those conversations that are real for both parties. And there's also a need for that conversation to be able to continue even after international aid and personnel depart, as they will, as they should, as they must, if not entirely, at least in large part. I think the second point, this sort of technology, we're in a much higher tech world, and you see a lot of people running around with GPSs, handheld GPS and laptops and the rest. And I remember a comment by Alex DeWall talking about famine in Darfur. And I'm not sure it's his term or somebody else's. He talked about the citadel of expertise, where we defined famine in such a high-tech way that an average average agrarian wouldn't know famine if it came up and bit him. He knows exactly what it means to him, but the famine early warning systems and the global satellites and all the rest of it have so technologized the analysis and the response that he's not able to participate in any meaningful way in either the diagnosis or the response and the cure. And I think we have to be also careful about that. We have technologized the humanitarian aid effort to a degree that local participants are so daunted by what they need to learn. And we are so enthusiastic about what we bring that there's a gap. There's a learning gap. And that transfer of information and skills has to be part of, I think, the overall response, so that is left behind, and that those technologies and tools are adapted to the local realities and learn from them as well.
Ms. Cohen, did you want to respond?
Just to the part of the observation about so many players. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's a terrible problem. The UN does try to coordinate, at least the UN agencies and the non-governmental organizations that are implementing partners of the UN agencies, and a big effort has been made by the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, also with regard to the funding, so that if there's a global fund that they're trying to set up, and there's consolidated appeals to try to put some order into this and avoid the duplication. And the record is mixed about how well they're doing, but there's an effort. When it comes to the NGOs, and maybe if there are NGOs here who want to comment, I always find this tremendously confusing. You have hundreds, enormous numbers that suddenly arrive. Some of them do fabulous work, and they've been in the areas before, and they know how to operate. And then there are all these other groups, and I think part of the problem is funding, because people want to give money and they give it to some group, and the group comes out. And while I wasn't in Indonesia now, I was in Sri Lanka, and I was at an IDP, a sort of settlement place where they were, and there had been an NGO, an international NGO there, and they'd been there since the beginning, and they had just left the week that I arrived. And the people, the IDPs, were so delighted they'd gone. And then we heard a whole litany of why. And you wonder, well, how did such a group comes out with such little consultation with the population they're working with? I don't know how you deal with that. There are standards, there are efforts, there are minimum standards. There's been proselytizing as well in Sri Lanka and Indonesia by different groups. I'm not sure how you get a handle on that. I think it produces a lot of, it makes a great contribution in some ways, and in other ways it's a disaster.
Did you want to respond, Mr. Harwood?
Yeah, I think about a facilitator, I think the RR and the World Bank estimate there are actually currently 35,000 facilitators in Aceh. But not necessarily they are good facilitator, or I should say trained. You see, the problem is like this, because even Acehnese themselves are not a homogeneous society. So, and all these facilitators might come from a very different ethnic groups with their different cultures again. And I remember, for instance, my friend who a sociologist from University of Indonesia have this project in Aceh. He built a lot of local NGOs, and the idea was they only provide the material, but the people should build their own house as part of the therapy. And then a week later, the UNDP came with Cash for Work program, and of course it killed this other program, because now you can work for payment for your own house. So now if you go to Aceh, it's very difficult to get anyone to work without pay, even for their own house. So which is the best facilitator? Is it this my friend facilitator who thought that part of the therapy is you build your own house, they help you with the materials and other material, or the UNDP who come and says you do anything, we'll give you work for cash. And it's getting a bit irritating. Something you go there now, you bring camera, you take picture, people ask for money for taking their pictures, and it's but it's happened everywhere. I know it's happened and also now they're complaining about that to rent a house in Banda Aceh is no more expensive than in Jakarta, because 1,500 foreigners come to Banda Aceh and rented all the best houses there, and of course all the nice cars, and you begin to have sandwich cafes and so on. And this happened also in Cambodia, in Timor-Leste, everywhere, where suddenly you have an enclave of people who have a very different and much more luxurious lifestyle. And after a while, the local people now are beginning to think, hey, they profited from us, so why don't we profit from them too? So, but this is not. I'm not saying this so that means we shouldn't help them anymore. But I think clearly there should be some sort of a training, I think, in facilitator. And the other problem is, for instance, there's this group from Kuwait come, bring a lot of money, and they thought, oh, the fishermen need boat, so they bought few hundred of fiberglass boats, and then the design was not, not adequate for them, and the local fishermen there is very particular, not only about, the boat, but on the wood of the boat has to be specific, and it has to be given to the chairman, the traditional chairman of the group. So when it was given, so now those hundreds of fiberglass boats are used as water container. And there are some houses in Chalang, for instance, are built but empty because this newspaper group, the Jawa Post group, hire a contractor to build 800 houses, but without running water. And so more than half are still empty now. So there are a lot of this, but it cannot be avoided, because this is for everyone. This is new. There is just a lot of goodwill to help, and there is no expertise on how to do it correctly. and also there is no expertise how to receive it correctly. And I don't know. I think this should probably be, another lesson learned from the Aceh. But my feeling is about this technology is also, I think some part in Aceh is actually the most advanced in terms of internet wise. Although now it started to be gone because, for instance, Intel has stopped its rent-free internet, and other the pledge did not come out. So some of the NGO who are used to have all this free internet suddenly now have to pay or have no facilities anymore. And I don't know. I think it's slowly we have to come to term that life back to normal. That means also you have to pay for everything. And if that facility is not being used, wisely, then it will be stopped because it just become too expensive. My worry now is that at one point there's going to be a sudden stop of this. There are no longer 1,500 foreigners there with maybe at least $3,000 to $7,000 salary will be gone, and that will take a big chunk of economy from Banda Aceh, and then it will suffer. So I think the BRR have to think about how to have some sort of a soft landing strategy to overcome this problem that eventually will come. It's a matter of when.
Okay, next question.
Yes, my name is John Swallow, and I'm with the firm Juarez and Associates. And similar to several others in this room, I was formerly Foreign Service with USAID. And I'm especially interested in the school system. And Dr. Robinson mentioned that there were nearly 1,500 schools destroyed and approximately 150,000 children without schooling. I'd like to ask the three of you, but especially Mr. Hari Murthy, how is the resumption of the formal school year going? And has this presented an opportunity for enhanced quality and relevance in that schooling?
Okay. Well, this is actually, I don't know whether the result is good, better, or worse. The thing is, before they used to have very standardized national school, and now a lot of foundation come with their own idea of what a good school should be, and they want to have a really good school because they have a lot of money. Now, will this school create a new educated but foreigners to the old ways, or will they become really the next generation who will construct Aceh in a new way, a much better way? I think it is still very open to the market, but my feeling now is Aceh has become a plethora of ideas about what a good education is. And I guess if you believe in a free market of ideas, the best will survive, the worst will not survive. But of course, the vagaries of people who are caught in the bad school will be paid in the future. But you have to also remember, even before tsunami, the national school, there are more than 1,000 of those schools were burned by the rebels, because for the rebel, the Indonesian school system is considered as the first virus of Indonesia, which they don't like it. In fact, it is in the official book of Hasan Tiro that this education system, he who create Javanese out of Achenese. So that's why this civic teachers were quite often kidnapped or threatened during before the tsunami. But now I think The problem is because there's not enough teachers. Many teachers perish or they move out. And there are still some places where there are not enough building, but there are some places where there are buildings without enough students because of all this uncoordinated effort. And you know, there was even a controversy because some people want to bring the kids outside Aceh, and then they were accused of trying to change the religions. So the government has to make a police operation to stop this kind of quote unquote trafficking. So I don't know. I think my simple answer is I think it's messy. It's good for the one who somehow get into the good school. It's bad for someone who didn't get into school. But I think things will improve a lot when this road built by America will start this year with 245 kilometers between Banda Aceh and Malabo, because there are a lot of places isolated exactly because the old road perished. And there are some communities that basically isolated, and I hope with this road, when it's finished the end of this year, the French want to build a railroad system. The opening of the isolation, I hope, will be in the end better than before. I agree with this key informant that you mentioned. I think in Aceh you need to construct a new, but who decide that? Do we decide that, or do we leave it to the Acehnese? If you leave it to the Acehnese, you know, they are traditional. Some traditions, they don't believe in gender equality. Do we have to become a carpetbagger to liberate the women, or what? This is, I think the best thing to do is just make sure Aceh remain open, and therefore, you know, whatever ideas can come from outside, and the Acehnese have the ability to choose from what is available, the world can offer them, with whatever consequences. I think we have to believe that Acehnese can handle that. They are equal person like us.
Did you want to say?
I can't give you any statistics on schools and number of school teachers and how many Acehnese are being retrained to replace those who were killed or injured. I can give you a parallel example from the Ministry of Health initiative, and I remember an early in January coordination meeting that actually was chaired by the Minister of Health. I forget his name. Came up from Jakarta, and he basically, as all these NGOs were clamoring to plant their flag somewhere and say, we want this, we want control of this district, all health services come under us, etc. He said, I've got a couple of demands I'm going to make. You're going to have to commit to a year. You're going to have to commit to rebuild our puskesmas and posyandos. You can't build a parallel health system. So whatever you're coming from, you're going to have to integrate it into our system. You're going to rebuild on our terms. And you're going to rebuild where we tell you to rebuild. Now, on the one hand, that's rather autocratic, and one might say, well, he's from Jakarta, he's not really understanding the Acehnese perspective, etc. But it certainly was an authentic Indonesian perspective. And I think it had to be listened to, respected, maybe challenged at times. But that stands against every private organization and even UN organizations' interest in doing things the way they feel it should be done according to best practice, whether it's acknowledging equal rights for women, whether it's representing what we know to be or believe to be certainly a universal principle or a better way of doing things. How do you build better, rebuild what was there before, add in elements that may be quite foreign and yet integrate them into things that are locally, culturally appropriate, do all of that in a way that's standardized across district and sub-district and even village lines, and avoid the mess and the chaos and the accusations of inequity. And I think the short answer is you don't and you can't, and I suspect right now it's pretty messy. And lots of different models are emerging about how schools ought to run and how clinics ought to be run and how water and sanitation systems ought to be constructed and maintained. And a lot of money being pushed around to try to negotiate one way versus another, and not enough coordination and not enough overall vision. And one of the things that the UN and other entities in the humanitarian relief and development community wrestle with is what's the best model? Do you give all schools over to, say, UNICEF to work with the Ministry of Education and the NGOs all work under that model? Or do you give multi-sectoral responsibility in a localized area to a single entity that does not just schools but water, sanitation, roads, bridges, etc., which is a much more integrated approach. It makes sense at the local level, but gives rise to these very disparate kinds of realities from one place to the next. Neither model works very well. Neither one, I think, has any specific evidence that says it's better than the other, and both are in competition right now to win out.
Perhaps I can help with the numbers, just to tell you that.
There we go.
Okay, the tsunami claimed the lives of 2,500 teachers. Yeah, 121,000 students were displaced, 2,000 schools were damaged, but by now most of the children are back at school, almost everyone. Some teachers came from other parts of the country. And now the focus is real on rebuilding the schools.
Ms. Cohen, you wanted to ask a question of one of your co-panelists?
Oh, yeah, I wanted to ask a question of the editor of Tempo about women. It's constantly pointed out that the women are not being given enough of a role in the reconstruction process. They're not being consulted sufficiently. Do you see any opportunities here with all the changes and the openness now for making any changes here? You've talked, I mean, you know Mr. Contoro. How do you see this playing out? I realize there are cultural ways, but how do you see it? Because there are enough problems for women that at least are listed constantly, and so their voices are very important.
Well, I think Mr. Kuntoro will shy away from this kind of cultural carpetbagging because he is a Japanese, and you know Japanese are not very popular among the Acehnese people. But I think he leave it more for the NGOs to do that because it's much safer. And in fact, the interesting development is that when they draft this new law for Aceh, the one that came from GAM cross out the Sharia. So the GAM doesn't want to have an Islamic Sharia law imposed there, and they don't want to use the word Nanggro Aceh. And this to me is, if anyone here is familiar with the history of Aceh, culturally Aceh always been divided by two groups. One we call the Tengku, which is the ulamas or the Muslim scholars, and the Teku, which is the aristocrat based more on custom. And in fact, the last war between these two groups happened in 1944, I think, which devastated Ifak. And the ulamas, even among themselves, there are some groupings. In the history, there has been some wars between, for instance, the one who follow the Saudi Arabia Wahhabi traditions and the one that's more on the Persian traditions. So you cannot say that Aceh is a one homogeneous entity. it is very plural. It has its his shares of queens in the bus. So I don't want you to get this stereotype of traditional Muslim in Wahhabist way. And there are a lot of Acehnese women who are very active and very successful, and they are the one actually now who are trying to quote unquote liberate their sisters, and I think it's a safer one. And actually, I'm among the one who provoked the Acehnese woman to rebel against this Sharia law, because it is, I think it's only very minority of Acehnese want to have a Sharia law there. I mean, you have to wear this thing and so on. But I think I'll give them less than 5 years, they will have this rebellion and successful.
Let's take one more brief question. Right back there.
Hi, my name is Kennedy from Voice of America. I've noticed that all the panelists here have given a high mark for the BRR, and not long time ago I've read the article in Wall Street Journal which validates your points that how BRR is a very clean agency and how it creates a new culture of clean administration in the local government. My question is, can you give us a sense that, because in the article it illustrates how the presence of BRR has created tensions with and jealousy from the local provincial bureaucracy, because BRR is seen as the darling of everybody's, and how the local bureaucracy are not compensated as highly as the BRR staffs and everything. Can you give us a sense of the dynamics between how the BRR cooperate with the local government bureaucracy, and do they operate independently of each other? Thank you.
Is that addressed to anyone in particular?
No, anybody.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting because the official salary of the chief of BRR is higher than our president official salary, which is about $7,500 per month, while our president receives around $6,200 a month. That's create, of course, some controversies. Even though actually it is only 1/3 of what the central bank governor of Indonesia earned officially. But to me and to many of the progressive people in the current government, it is actually, Tsunami will not only change Aceh, but we are hoping it will construct a new Indonesia, because BRR bureaucracy is a new, different concept where you get professional salary, but that's all. You are not allowed to receive anything else, and you are expected to work professionally. In Indonesian bureaucracy, the paradigm is you receive almost non-existent official salary, but you get quite a big income from what we call a development budget. Even if you don't need to be corrupt to earn a big income as an Indonesian official. What you need is to be in a good position, because the way the Indonesian bureaucracy run is like multi-level marketing, which is basically the more downline you have, the higher your income. And what is your downline is because in the Indonesian bureaucratic system, the officials' monthly salary is very small. Then you have all this honorarium system, which is mainly all your work you turn it into project. and then for every project you receive honorarium. And if the higher you are in the rank, then they always officially involve you in all the committee under you, even though you don't know anything about it. So one of the busiest day for bureaucrat is at the end of the month, where he has to sign all this receipt of honoraria of all the committee under his jurisdiction, which more than 50% he never even heard about it. But because he is the Director General, he received all this honorarium, which could be 20 times more than his own official salary, 20 to 40 times more. And why it's done this way in Indonesia is because in Indonesia it's very difficult to punish a bureaucrat. Even my friend who did not go to office for 3 years could not get fired. You know, and therefore, in order to make the boss have any control over their subordinate, the only way is that the boss has the right to include who is in the committee and who are not. So like my friend who didn't go for 3 years, he doesn't belong to any committee, so he just receives a very meager salary. While the one who's close to the boss will be involved in the maximum of committee. And we are talking here not about corruption. This is totally about the system, the official system work. But the problem with this system is it creates the environment that there is no clear line between corrupt money and not corrupt money. And especially, for instance, when they send people, they haven't changed the stipend, for instance, for going out of town for the past 15 years. And that creates a problem because the money 15 years ago, due to inflation, is enough for you to stay in a 3-star hotel. But of course, 15 years later, it's not even enough to stay in the cheapest hotel. So if you are a good boss and you have to send your subordinate to go for a duty outside of city, you have to claim he goes 2 days, you have to give him a receipt for going 10 days, in order not in order to enrich them, but just in order to make them survive. But of course, this is by definition is already a corruption. And then from that to receive thank you money, to receive everything is very easy. And I think Kuntoro, and I think this is also part of the president project, he want to, if BRR is successful, it could be shown to public, let's reform our bureaucratic system like this successful model. But of course, this is a very long-term view, because the problem now is that with this kind of system, I asked my friend, for instance, who are working at a low level, he said, why do you want to work in this government office? You do most of the work in the committee, but you receive the least honorarium because the honorarium is based on percentage of your salary. While your boss, who doesn't know anything, he might be asleep when you do all this work, will receive a much higher honorarium. And he told me, well, it's okay for me because I dream that one day I will be like my boss. And now imagine you want to reform this system, the resistance would be from people who are at the top or near the top. Imagine you are near the top, you have sacrificed yourself receiving all this low honorarium and hard work, and when it's time for you to reach the nice position, no work with a lot of money, suddenly they change again. So this is our problem.
Okay, on that note, regretfully, we're going to have to end it here. I hope that I speak for everyone in saying this has been a very enriching program this afternoon. Thank the speakers and for all of you. And I believe that Robert Hathaway will have the last word.
Thanks, Michael. Lest, Michael, you be under any misconceptions. If you don't show up for work for 3 years, you do not get paid. I, on the other hand, am looking for that high salary, no work job. Now, I just wanted to say thanks to all three of our speakers, all of whom are very busy people, all of whom are very much in demand. We are flattered and honored that you chose to come to the Wilson Center today, and we want you to know that we are very grateful. Similarly to our audience, none of this happens and none of this works if you all don't come and keep coming back, and we've been gratified that you continue to come back. If by any chance we don't have your email address, please leave it with Michael, with myself, or with Mark in the back of the room so that we can make sure you know about our programs in the future. We look forward to having you back again, and on that note, we will adjourn. Thanks a lot.
I was very glad to meet the tempo. I will try.
Now I'm practically free until 14 in the morning. 14 is Saturday in the morning, but I live in my flight is 7. Tomorrow, okay? Okay, good. Philly, okay. Everything in Sheffield Hotel? Wait, what is it?
Both all right?
Yes. Like everybody else, getting Hi. Just sit here, should we go downstairs? No, I just wanted to try to get
All right. We all need
If you go to our website, let me, no, because the website came on it's Tsunami.
Yes, that's right.